It's the final day of the Manila Dialogue on the South China Sea, and Taiwan Talks has secured two of the conference's biggest speakers, titans in their fields, together with our international relations expert here in Taiwan. Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ian Kavat. We're privileged to have finally, and joining us from the dialogue itself in the Philippines, Antonio Carpio, former Philippine Supreme Court Associate Justice. We also have Bill Hayton, also joining us from the Manila Dialogue, Chatham House Asia Pacific Program Associate Fellow. And finally, in the studio, we have Ronan Fu, Academia Sinica, Institute of Political Science Assistant Research Fellow. A very warm welcome to everybody to Taiwan Talks today. Justice Carpio, you'll be making a lot of our viewers very happy by appearing on Taiwan Talks today. They've mentioned your name in comments many times. I want to start with the historic speech that you made at Ateneo de Davao University College of Law in 2011, which effectively launched your campaign for the Philippines to seek international arbitration on the West Philippine Sea. And you said, this battle to defend our EEZ from China, the superpower in our region, is the 21st century equivalent of the battles that our forebears waged against Western and Eastern colonizers from the 16th to the 20th century. It is modern day battle. The best and the brightest legal warriors in our country today must stand up and fight to free the EEZ of the Philippines from foreign encroachment. And in your book, you say this Chinese aggression is the gravest external threat to the Philippines since World War II. So I wanted to ask you, Justice Carpio, why have you framed it in this way?
The South China Sea dispute, the encroachment of China of our exclusive economic zone and island territories in the West Philippine Sea is actually the gravest threat facing the Philippines in these modern times. And you have to compare it to the great invasions that visited the Philippines during the colonial period and during World War II. So this is a threat that my generation is facing today. And we have to face it the same way that our forebears faced the invasions that they encountered during their time.
Bill, if I could go to you. Let's get to the biggest underlying issue in the South China Sea, which is China's claims that its so-called historical rights override all exclusive economic zones of the coastal states. Let's take a look at the Chinese delegates' remarks on your panel at the Manila Dialogue. Watch.
More than 2,000 years ago, our Chinese ancestors began navigating the South China Sea and learning about it through maritime activities, discovering and naming the South China Sea islands. At least since Tang and Song dynasties, China began to administer the islands and nearby waters of the South China Sea. They are all recorded in the rich and reliable records of China throughout the history.
Bill?
Well, I mean, I find that whole narrative, kind of fantastic, really. I mean, the idea that 2,000 years ago, Chinese sort of people were naming these islands and administering them is preposterous, really. I mean, the names that are used by Chinese authorities today to describe the islands were given during the 20th century, by and large, and some of them, ironically, even honour the names of, for example, English managers of the East India Company that's just been translated into Chinese. For example, Money Island is named after a man called William Money. And going back, I mean, the South China Sea for centuries, for thousands of years, has been a shared space where fisher people and traders from all around the sea and beyond, from the Middle East, from India, have travelled across the sea for trade and for fishing. And all the other activities that we do at sea, piracy sometimes. So the idea that it was any one state's domain, I'm afraid, is just a silly reading of history.
Now, Justice Carpio, if I can go back to you, your research reaches back centuries as well, before the Common Era, and you've gathered lots of Chinese evidence to prove that China didn't control the South China Sea and actually spent most of history ignorant of the existence of, firstly, the Paracel Islands and then the Spratlys. But I wanted to deal, if possible, with two things that China tends to use to claim sovereignty, and that's the name, the South China Sea, and also Nine Dash Line. Could I get your assessment of those two?
Well, the name South China Sea was coined by Portuguese navigators when they reached the South China Sea to distinguish the South China Sea from the East China Sea. This was not coined by the Chinese. The Chinese South Sea, not South China Sea. All the ancient maps of China were published by the People's Republic of China in the 3-volume book, the Atlas of the Ancient Maps of China. And in all those maps, the southernmost territory of China was Hainan, without exception, from way from the Song Dynasty to the last dynasty. China moved out of Hainan only in 1932 when France seized the paracels. China protested, and China said that the paracels constitute the southernmost territory of China. But several years later, in 1947, China claimed the Spratlys, which is further south of the paracels. So China's been claiming through what I call a creeping invasion, from Hainan to the paracels to the Spratlys.
Yeah, and Justice, reading your book, I see that actually even before the Portuguese, this sea was actually known as the Champa Sea. Is that correct?
Yes, before it was known as South China Sea or South Sea by the Chinese. The South China Sea is called the Champa Sea because of a powerful maritime kingdom established by the Chams in central Vietnam. The Chams were Austronesians. These are the people who went out, immigrated out of Taiwan. They populated central Vietnam. They populated the Philippines all the way to Indonesia, Melanesia, Polynesia, and peninsular Malaysia. It was the widest migration by sea of people in history. And the Austronesians were masters of the South China Sea. They crisscrossed the South China Sea all the time. So, and before the Chinese empire reached the South China Sea, the Chams were already the masters of the South China Sea, the Austronesians.
And if I could go back to Bill. Bill, if we can talk about the 9-dash line. I mean, your research also says the same. Essentially, the Chinese before the 20th century didn't really claim the South China Sea. Tell us how the 9-dash line came about.
Yeah, the 9-dash line specifically was only published in 1947 by what was then the Republic of China. And it was the result of meetings after the Second World War. Because there was actually a great deal of uncertainty in China at the time about exactly where its borders lay. And that was for many reasons, because you'd had half a century of disruption following the emergence of the Republic of China in 1911, 1912. And you'd had attacks from Japan, you'd had the fact that Tibet and Xinjiang and Mongolia had broken away and that kind of thing. And so the whole border was in a state of flux. And so meetings were convened after the Second World War. Where are our borders? And this is entirely the opposite of the way that China presents it today, which is that the borders have always been the same and always been fixed. So you had these meetings, and they employed geography professors to decide which islands to claim. And they claimed them, interestingly, just using the translations of Western names. So, for example, Vanguard Bank off southeastern Vietnam just becomes Chanwei in Chinese, which is the Chinese equivalent, or Haimatan, which is Seahorse Bank. The name is exactly the translation from English into Chinese, just off the coast of the Philippines. And basically, looking back at the work of some of these rather amateur geographers of the 1930s, they came up with this line, which stretches all the way down to the James Shoal, almost on the coast of Borneo. And the James Shoal itself doesn't exist as an island. It's an underwater feature. It's 22 meters below sea level.
So bringing you in, Ronan, Bill just mentioned there the original 9-dash line did come from the ROC, which is Taiwan. And our viewers sometimes see a disconnect then in Taiwan talks, or Taiwan supporting the Philippines in the West Philippine and the South China Sea, and saying essentially Taiwan claims Philippine territory as well. What do you say to that?
Yeah, so I want to actually make a strong case that it's more important or more vital to acknowledge Taiwan's position right now. As a modern democracy, what we really want to show the involvement of our position. Right now, our government's official policy is that we support the peaceful resolution of all the disputes based on what? Based on international law, and in particular, the UNCLOS. So I think right now the most important distinction is behavior. We hope that we can demonstrate to the world and to Philippines in particular that you have to trust us, because look at our behavior. Right now, we are not using the historical facts or historical claims.
It's also a different political administration that has been in Taiwan for 3 terms now. That must make a difference as well. And I guess
yes.
what you're saying is there's a difference between sort of de facto and de jure. So de facto, what we do in practice, which is that Taiwan only claims a couple of those features from history. It has no claim on the others. Is that correct?
That's correct. And also, we are not trying to militarize all the contested islands, unlike what PRC has been doing. So these are very important distinctions that we have to make.
Okay, and also Taiwan faces an existential threat itself from the PRC. Justice Carpio, if I can bring you back in, but even if history was on China's side, which we've established that it is not, you stated at the Manila Dialogue that UNCLOS effectively extinguished historical rights. And yet, let's listen to this.
So China's activities in the South China Sea islands and reefs predate the emergence of the law of the sea, denying China's historical rights in the South China Sea based on inconsistencies with the UNCLOS is essentially, from my opinion, denying the historical fact of China's jurisdiction, sovereignty and jurisdiction over the South China Sea islands and reefs and relevant waters.
Justice, if you could explain to us why it was necessary for UNCLOS to extinguish historical rights for all countries, not just for China, and why it is that China can keep claiming South China Sea ownership predates UNCLOS?
Thank you. The purpose of UNCLOS is to preserve peace and stability in all oceans and seas of our planet. And if countries are allowed to invoke historical events 2,000 years ago, then there will be no end, there will be no peace and stability in the oceans and seas of our planet. For example, Rome called the Mediterranean their Mare Nostra, our sea. And if you go back to history, then the entire Mediterranean Sea will belong to Italy today. And that's a fact, because Rome really controlled the Mediterranean during Roman times. And if we follow the papal bull that divided the world between Portugal and Spain, the New World, then Spain and Portugal will get back everything. So the world has moved on. The framers of UNCLOS decided that countries cannot claim based on history, because then there will be perpetual wars.
Right.
To preserve peace and stability, except for the territorial sea, which was an old regime, the entire high seas, which actually belonged to mankind, was divided further into the exclusive economic zone, extended continental shelf, and the high seas. And UNCLOS says in the exclusive economic zone, the right to exploit all the natural resources, living and non-living, belongs exclusively to the adjacent coastal state. In fact, China was one of the strongest proponents for the exclusive economic zone against the developed countries, against the established maritime powers at that time. The developed countries want a smaller economic zone. So the developing countries won that battle, and China was one of the architects of that battle. But today, China is denying countries in the South China Sea, coastal states, its own exclusive economic zone.
They seem to want it both ways.
By saying it's really mind-boggling that a country can own an entire sea.
Okay.
If that happens, then the UNCLOS will collapse. If UNCLOS cannot apply to the South China Sea, it cannot apply to the rest of the seas of the world.
Okay, let me bring in Ronan. You wanted to jump in there?
Yeah, I just want to very quick to point out that China was actually a very active participant in the UNCLOS negotiation for a decade, and they rectified it in 1996, right? So they knew exactly what they were agreeing to, trading very vague historic claims for what? For concrete 21st century, easy rights.
Okay.
Right.
So they shouldn't be allowed to have this sort of picking and choosing of what they want to follow and what they don't want to. Bill, if I can bring you back in. Going back to your panel again, Wu claimed that only international legal practice based on history can gain its legitimacy. Now hold that thought for a second. Only history gaining legitimacy as we listen to him again. Watch this.
So, since the defeat and the surrender of Japan after the Second World War, the Chinese government dispatched the sailors and officials to recover the islands in the South China Sea in accordance with Cairo Declaration and Potsdam Proclamation.
So, Bill, what therefore do you think China really means when it says history is the only legitimacy?
Well, I think what they're trying to do is say, while we agree with international law in principle, we don't want to see it applied in practice in certain circumstances. And so, and the point of this is because, back in 2016, the Philippines won a really, landmark international arbitration case against China. And China has never accepted that ruling. And so basically what it's trying to say is that there are other principles of international law which should be applied and which should take precedence over this ruling. And it's legal sophistry, if you like. It's a way of basically trying to change the subject and avoid implementing the ruling that's been imposed on China. I don't doubt, you saw that picture there about the Chinese expedition to the Paracels in December to the Spratly Islands in December 1946. I mean, no doubt that happened, and a claim was made to Aba, to Taiping Dao in Chinese, a feature which is now occupied by Taiwan. I'm not doubting that, but what they're trying to do is basically say that. And this actually is one of Dr. Wu's kind of inventions, is that he constructs the Chinese claim in the South China Sea in three parts. He said basically China has a claim to the rocks and the reefs and the features in the South China Sea. It accepts UNCLOS where it supports China's claims, and then it wants something else. It wants this thing called historic rights, and then it basically says that anywhere inside the U-shaped line, China has an extra right for the fish, the oil, the gas, and the management and control of navigation, which ships can go through. And that's the key part, and that's the bit that the tribunal ruling basically said was illegitimate and unlawful. And yet China keeps on, pressing this idea. And we heard it again, at the Manila dialogue this week.
Bringing Ronan in, of course, Taiwan's status is also tied up in this, given Taiwan was a Japanese colony for 50 years until the end of World War II. However, is it only recently that we've been seeing this very strong connections between the plight of Taiwan and the Philippines and the West Philippine Sea?
Yeah, in fact, the connection has been there geographically, but recent development made this strategic linkage, undeniable or even more salient. And here are the following, development. Number one, as we have discussed, ever since 2017, all the militarization of the artificial islands and, the intrusion of the EEZs of other countries, basically, this has made not just about fishing, right? It's about the regional stability, basically unsettled by a specific country's behavior. So that's number one. Number two, ever since the 2016 ruling, basically it provides an overarching or universal principle that a lot of countries can actually have it at our toolkit, right? So that further, strengthen the connection possibility. And third and most critically, going back to the geography again, basically, the instability in this region or the connection basically will unsettle a lot of international trade and trade possibilities. So that's the reason why this connection is even stronger than ever.
Okay. Now, after it seized Mischief Reef in 1995, China then seized Scarborough Shoal in 2012. 13 years later, this September, it established a nature reserve at Scarborough Shoal, known as Mischief Reef in Taiwan, banning Philippine access, even though the 2016 arbitral ruling decreed that the shoal is the traditional fishing ground of the Philippines, China, and Vietnam. Many analysts believe China's actions mean it will militarize the shoal next. Justice Carpio, if I can bring you in, but you had already predicted this in 2011. Can you explain how you forecast this and what is China's strategic obsession with Scarborough Shoal?
Well, we go back to Fiery Cross Reef, 1997, when China established a radar weather station in Fiery Cross Reef in the Spratlys. And China announced at the time that it was just trying to help UNESCO in its global oceanic survey. So it was an environmental approach. And nobody complained because China was trying to help UNESCO in its global oceanic survey. But today, Fiery Cross Reef is an air and naval base of China with a 3-kilometer long runway. And all airplanes, bombers of China can take off and land in that airstrip. And so China is replicating this again in Scarborough Shoal. China is saying we are just putting up a nature reserve, and we will probably put up a monitoring station, just like the radar weather station that China established in 1997 in Fiery Cross Reef. And later on, it will expand into a air and naval base. And that's the approach of China. And the China used this approach also in Mischief Reef. In 1995, China seized Mischief Reef and said, we are just putting a fisherman's shelter. And now that fisherman's shelter is the largest air and naval base of China in the Spratlys. It has a 3-kilometer runway, defended with anti-ship missiles, anti-aircraft missiles, fully operational air and naval base. So that's why I'm saying China will do the same in Scarborough Shoal, because China needs a triangle of air and naval bases in the Spratlys, in the Paracels in Woody Island, and in Scarborough Shoal, so that it can control the entire South China Sea. Right now, there are gaps in its control because its fighter jets and its missiles cannot reach the entire area in the north of, in the area of Scarborough Shoal. So China will put up an air and naval bases in Scarborough, and this will help China in the invasion of Taiwan because it's very close. Mm-hmm. And in case of if China invades Taiwan, they will have to close the Basi Channel, and they need an air and naval base in Scarborough Shoal to close the Basi Channel. Mm. So this is all connected.
A very good point there. Bringing Bill back in, therefore, are you surprised China has acted so slowly at Scarborough Shoal? And, we're talking 1990s, 2010s. Now everybody's on to China. So can China be stopped from militarizing Scarborough Shoal?
It's a really good question. And I think there's a lot of stuff to do with US-China, Philippines relations that remains hidden, and we maybe will only find out about it, when things are declassified in future years. There was a very interesting story that came out in 2016 towards the end of the Obama administration, when it was suggested by some reporting out of Washington that the Americans had suspected that China was about to occupy and build something on Scarborough Shoal, and that they were readying dredging vessels and construction equipment to go and build there. And the Obama administration deployed A-10 attack aircraft to the Philippines. But that part we know is true because we saw them. But the messaging apparently from the Americans to the Chinese at that point was that if the Americans see those dredging ships and other equipment moving towards Scarborough Shoal, they will be attacked by the American planes. And nothing happened. Now, we don't know whether this is true, but it was never denied by anybody, this report. So maybe it was a blunt warning of military action that prevented China from building on the Scarborough Shoal back in 2016. And maybe those warnings have held firm until now. But of course, there are so many other things in play at the moment with the US-China relationship. And obviously, Donald Trump is thinking about Ukraine and Gaza and winning a Nobel Peace Prize. Maybe he's not entirely focused on the Scarborough Shoal. So it is possible, of course, that the Chinese think they might have another attempt. And by talking about a nature reserve, who could possibly object to a nature reserve? And then maybe I think that the Chinese might just be trying their luck again and waiting for the response and seeing what happens.
Well, that will have to be the last word because we've run out of time. I just want to thank Ronan Fu in the studio and also to thank our guests online. So that's Justice Carpio, Antonio Carpio and Bill Hayton from the Philippines. Thank you so much. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching the show today. Stay safe and see you next time.